Lord and say, welcome everyone. Nice to see all of you this morning. And let's start with a blessing for our study. Baruch atah
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
b'divrei Torah. Amen. So finishing up Genesis chapter 2, the last couple of verses there, we were looking at the creation of the woman now from the side or from the rib of the man, and Adam is so pleased. This one at last is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. Should be called Isha because she was taken from Ish, from man. And then the intriguing final sentence, hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. So that's where we are. I did want to say a question came to me offline this week about Lilith and why did we not spend time talking about Lilith? And my strong recollection is that when we were studying Genesis chapter 1, that we spent extensive time reviewing this midrash about Lilith, presumably the first woman created who then did not want to be subservient to Adam and flew away and became a kind of a demon who preyed on newborn children. Can I get like a head nod? Does this sound familiar that we talked about this?
Yeah.
I probably wasn't there.
So that's what I'm thinking, is that whoever was asking me about this maybe just missed that one session.
Yeah, because I don't have it in my notes either.
Mm-hmm. But Lisa Kaiser, I see you shaking your head. So that's
I remember a discussion of Lilith.
Thank you. That's very validating.
And if I was there and I don't remember it, that doesn't surprise me either.
Yeah. So what I want to do is, because I do believe that we have been recording all of these sessions, and so the session for chapter 1 should be on the Temple Chai YouTube channel. We have a playlist for Torah study. So if you are looking specifically for that information, I would encourage you to go back and review the Genesis chapter 1 and those discussions. And if anyone finds that particular discussion, because my recollection is that we spent a fair amount of time learning about and understanding that legend. So I really don't want to go back to it. But if someone finds and then would share with the rest of us the precise link as to when that conversation took place, that would be helpful.
I have a mention in my notes on January 10th.
Ah, that's so helpful, Marcy. Good. So let's.
I don't have a lot, but I have a mention of it, so I don't know.
Great. So that must have been it. So let's. So the first direction is folks who are interested in that, who don't recall the conversation, maybe weren't there on January 10th. Why don't you go back, find the recording for January 10th, listen to that, and then you can email me privately if you have questions that emerge from that conversation. Yes, David.
Which raises the question. I came across an article in a book called Dovka, written in 1973 by a young woman completing her doctorate by the name of Rachel Adler.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that tells you how far back. I still have the reference right here. And she gave a couple of paragraphs on Lilith and showing that very fascinating, her point of view on Lilith and the difference in the virtuous and God-fearing woman who would be Eve. And it is a fabulous article. I just don't know how to get it to you so that if you wanted to read it and share it.
Do you have a copy or a scanner, or did you?
Yeah, great. We got a copy of it here, the original.
Uh-huh.
And
do you have any capability to scan it?
Well, I'll see if I can get that scanner to work. It's a 14-year-old scanner that's a little flaky at times.
Yeah.
Okay.
David, I have an app for scanning and sending to the phone, a free app. So I'll
Okay.
send you.
Okay,
Right.
great. So maybe Matthew and David can work privately to figure out how to get us that article, and we could.
It was interesting. The thing about the Lilith was she was taking it from a point of view that if Lilith stood up to the patriarchy, then she became autonomous. And if she was autonomous, therefore she was to be challenging to man, just like Lucifer was a challenge to God. So I would say Rachel Adler brought in a lot of very, very different points of view on this entire article. The point of women in the Bible.
Right, so and you're saying that was published in 1973, which was really the nascent Jewish feminist movement.
Mhm.
But I'm willing to bet that whoever came up with the Lilith story came up with it within 3 generations, because I don't think it would take that long for a man to be suspicious of all women and create a monster.
Actually,
David, a quick question. David, are you
Yeah.
still having your flats photography at AOL?
yes.
Okay.
Don't share it with anybody. It's a secret.
Well, you got to get the spelling right.
Okay.
Okay, I just sent you a link to the app.
Okay. And as for Terry's, according to her article, references to Lilith are fragmentary, but found in Talmud and Midrash.
Oh, it took those guys to come up with it, huh?
Mhm.
Well, that's when it was.
My guess is it
that's
was
when
cooking
written-
for
that's
all
when it
those
was written
years.
down. That doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that those stories and myths did not exist for quite some time prior to that. I'm just checking my system preferences. I don't know why they're making noise. Okay. Do not disturb.
I'll try to get this out to everybody this week. I will tell you, it is ridiculously dense.
Okay, good. Well, so thank you for that. And per Marcy Burgess, let's go back and look at January 10th and see what the discussion was there. Good. So why, Rabbi Dov Peretz Elkins asks us, does the Torah require that man leave his parents? And
Can you repeat what page that's on, please?
it's on page 18. So it looks like this.
And on the red writing down below at the bottom, it says 14 and 14.
Okay, thanks, Barry.
Okay, so verse 23 begins by saying, then the man, Adam, said, one might assume that verse 20, okay, this is where we left off last time. We were looking at the words that are quoted. Are these being said by Adam or by God? And it's not 100% clear. So that's the discussion. Verse 23 begins by saying, then the man Adam said, one might assume that verse 24 is therefore a continuation of Adam's words, verse 24, because verse 23, this one at last is bone of my bones. Clearly, in the first person, Adam is speaking. Rashi argues that only verse 23 contains Adam's words. Verse 24 begins a new part, a new thought, not part of Adam's statement, and is an addendum by God himself, or as he says in parentheses, Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, who is teaching this important lesson about man leaving his parents and clinging to his wife. This verse and the message it contains is too important to be ascribed to Adam alone. So Rashi's argument, hence a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife so that they become one flesh, are the words of God, not the personal, private opinion of one individual. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, taking a lead from an earlier idea in the Talmud, suggests that we have here the basis for the prohibitions in Leviticus 18, 6 to 18, of incestuous relations. So it seems like kind of a leap.
Hmm.
And hence non-binding marriages whose children are in the category of mamzer, illegitimate in Jewish law. So just an aside reminder, mamzer, which we translate as bastard, is not the same word that we use in the English language when we mean bastard. When we say bastard in English, it is understood as the child of an unmarried couple. Is that a fair way to define it?
Mhm.
In Jewish law, there is no stigma associated with the child of an unmarried couple. A single woman who has a child is not a mamzer in Jewish law, is not a bastard. A mamzer in Jewish law is the product of a prohibited relationship. So that would be an incestuous or an adulterous relationship. So
Interesting.
it's really important that we be aware of the difference in usage. We're translating into English as bastard, but understand that the concept of what is a bastard is different. The Torah and in Leviticus and in later embellishments of this passage seems to sense far ahead of its time both the biological, genetic, and psychological dangers of marital bonds between close relatives. So I see now where Samson Raphael Hirsch is coming from. He's emphasizing the leaving his father and mother. So you want to get far away from them in order to find a wife, so as to minimize the chance of an incestuous connection. Hirsch is suggesting that this verse is warning us to go far from our parental homestead in seeking a mate, which of course, as the narrative develops, we'll see that Isaac does exactly that. Abraham sends his servant Eliezer far away. However, back home, where the chances are of finding a relative would seem to be increased. But as every married person knows, the process of shifting primary loyalties from parents to spouse is a gradual and difficult one, and is far more involved than simply physically leaving the parental home. I guess the assumption here is a culture of very young marriage. So when you're still young, and if the assumption is you're going from your parents' home to directly into a marriage without having time to establish an independent identity, that is not the easiest transition. For many people, it never happens completely, and thus has the potential to cause repetitive and severe conflicts between oneself, parents, and spouse. That's certainly true. Anybody ever been in a relationship with someone who was still primarily connected to their parent, and the parent was the primary relationship? It's not a recipe for a successful marriage.
You're talking about marrying a mama's boy?
Yes, or a daddy's girl, or
Yes.
whatever it is.
Helicopter parents for adult children.
Right. I mean, if you read Dear Abby, you see this every day.
Yeah. Or what about the opposite, when a parent doesn't want to let go of the kid?
That's a challenge as well.
And there's a push-pull between the spouse and the parent.
Right. So a parent in that situation could be highly destructive to the marriage relationship. And then the responsibility devolves onto the adult child to figure out how to set appropriate boundaries. So Dove Peretz-Elkins is correct that it's a challenging process. To whom is our greater loyalty? The man and woman whose physical union gave us our very life and breath, flesh and bones, who raised, nurtured, and loved us and launched us into the world. I mean, we owe a lot to our parents. It's right in the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. That's a big deal. Or to the person we choose as our mate and with whom we will in turn raise our own family and with whom we will spend most of our mature lives. So he's accurately describing this tension that we can find ourselves caught in the crossfire between parent and partner. Yes, Owen?
My father used to describe that as his primary job was to get us launched. And that when that was done, he got to be with my mother and saw that as a good thing and was really clear. When you guys are gone, the person I get to be with is the person I chose. And so a nice take on that.
It's a very healthy take. And too often we see the phenomenon of the empty nest, that once the kids are gone, then that couple bond can dissipate. If the only thing keeping the couple together is being co-parents,
right,
and once the kids are launched, the couple relationship can disappear as well. And even when raising kids, have you ever gone out with just either your partner or another couple and played this game? You know, who there's a financial penalty for whoever brings the kids up first. You know, try to have an adult conversation at the dinner table without mentioning the children. Right? It's
That's right.
yes. So I think all the laughing is laughter of recognition that is definitely a phenomenon. So the Torah is pointing out a real relationship challenge that we all recognize. How do we disconnect from our parents while still honoring them and form a primary relationship with our partner, and then create a healthy pattern with our own children as they grow and find partners of their own? A lot of complexities. In some cases, it feels as though we are between a rock and a hard place, trying to make such a difficult decision between two loyalties. The Torah, this is at the bottom of the page, the Torah is clearly telling us that shifting our primary loyalty at a designated point in our lives from our parents to our spouse is built into the design of the universe. I mean, this is only chapter 2 of the Torah. I mean, you know, right after food and water, and right after the creation of the second human being, this is the first thing that the Torah is recognizing. Wow, that's you know, that's a pretty prominent place. It really indicates the universality of this challenge. The Torah expresses this demand very clearly by telling us in no uncertain terms that we must leave our parents' home, and cling to our spouse. Now, the fact of the matter is that this is addressed to the man, not to the woman. So that's another whole level of discussion. Yeah, Terry?
I'm just wondering if the leaving of Eden isn't in itself a metaphor for just what you're describing, because in a sense, Eden was the protection of the parental umbrella, so to speak.
Well,
and when they make that commitment and change from just being, you know, two amorphous individuals, and the recognition of the fact that they become one, so to speak, through physical union, has changed their relationship distinctly. They aren't two playmates in the garden anymore, and they have to leave. And that seems like a reflection of exactly what this is talking about to me.
Yeah, I think it definitely resonates for me, and I could dial it back even one step further. You first the first leaving is leaving the womb. If the Garden of Eden is a paradise, how about the womb, where really there's no consciousness of any need. Becca.
It occurs to me, you said, look at this, we're in the second chapter and they're already saying, leave, go, go. This is also the way that you're going to create tribes. You're going to expand your universe.
Lech
You go- but-
lecha. Lech
Lech
lecha.
lecha. But it's all about, you don't want to stay narrow and limited in your physical proximity. You also want to take what you have and carry it outward into the world. And so this is another way to say, start building a community.
I have
So
a
I'm just,
question.
I'm just thinking about my own challenging environment, and waking up this morning to the weather report in Neenah, Wisconsin, where my children went far from their parents' home.
God damn it.
Right. The nerve of them. Did they read the Genesis? It's this morning it was minus 17 degrees.
Oh,
And that's like the wind chill.
And
I grew up in Wisconsin. That's just brisk.
the wind chill is minus 38.
Yeah.
That's a little nippy. Yeah.
And it's 80 degrees here.
And New York is getting another 6 inches of snow.
Oh, yeah.
there's rioting in Africa.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
We're talking about the man leaving his parents for a wife, but there's no kids yet.
Right.
I was thinking that, Marcy. I was thinking the same thing.
I was
It
just
was
wondering where the
talk
kids
about
were.
putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. That kind of, I don't know if it was a question or a statement, but it was sort of like, wait a minute, what? Yeah.
So
cart
this is-
before the
Well, I
horse.
think that makes it even more profound, that before the kids are even born, that the heads up is, guess what? They're going to grow up and have to go out on their own. And that's the way it is.
Isn't it all,
What's that?
Matthew, I think.
yeah, isn't it also setting up societal norms and values for what's going to come throughout the rest of
Absolutely.
that? Not everything in the early parts kicks in immediately. It's later. It's setting up a whole structure of how one is going to create a world that we're going to live in for generations.
Absolutely. So, continuing. Modern psychologists have expended a great deal of energy on this problem. Moving from one's parental home to one's own intimate relationship and home is part of the long, slow process of maturation. In our young, helpless years, we are clearly dependent on our parents and other caregivers. During adolescence, it is the task of the healthy, mature parent to prepare us to go off on our own, for them to let go of our dependence on them and let us go off into the world. The parent's task has been described eloquently in these words: to give their children roots and wings, a solid grounding during our growing up years, and the capacity to fly on our own at the end of adolescence. It's a shame that Felix is not here to give us the psychological perspective on how this functions well and doesn't. Owen, I want to plant the seed that maybe you want to respond to this. The process of raising children to the point of their independence is a natural and wholesome part of the child rearing process. It is healthy and necessary for both parent and child to reach the point at which the detailed daily process of nurturing comes to a reasonable end. And, my goodness, this has been really a phenomenon of contemporary life. What's it, in the last 5 or 10 years, that we suddenly have massive numbers of kids who are not launching into the world. I'm curious your thoughts on when precisely did that shift happen? Is it the last 5 years? Is it the last 10 years? But there's some statistically significant number of adult children who are not
Yo.
launching. Yeah, let me just read a little bit more, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts about how and why that has shifted. As adults, we continue to grow, but our guides and mentors expand considerably from the narrow circle of parents, significant relatives, teachers, and friends who brought us to the point of emotional, spiritual, and financial emancipation. The clear and unequivocal emphasis that the Torah places on this point of personal maturity and autonomy is necessary for both parents and children. It is a two-sided action that is required for the ultimate welfare of both parents and children. Parents must accept their empty nest status, and children must begin a life that is totally their own. Any obstacles in this process of psychological separation, what Jung calls individuation, will impede the further growth of both sides of the equation, parent and child. Let me just read the last paragraph and then we can unpack it. For the Torah to have recognized this crucial, difficult, and definitive turning point in the normal life cycle of the generations is further evidence of its far-sighted psychological and spiritual wisdom, centuries ahead of its time. It is one small detail which gives the creation myth in Genesis 1 and 2 the spiritual credibility wherein lies its greatest wisdom and value, and more than makes up for what it may lack in scientific accuracy. It is, after all, the ultimate purpose of God's creation to have each creature set out on the lifelong journey of self-reliance, self-realization, and self-fulfillment. The Torah has now clearly legitimated this process and laid the groundwork for the unending journey to commence in its fullest sense. I thought that was a very interesting and provocative discussion. So it comes from this book, which we really haven't explored much, but maybe as we get into more narrative material, we'll come back to. It's the Bible's top 50 ideas. So Rabbi Dov Peretz-Elkins, an incredibly creative contemporary rabbi, just picked out 50 verses in the entire Torah that he finds to be very meaningful and relevant, and explicates them in some short chapters. So there we have it. Yes, Owen.
You're muted, Owen.
Unmute yourself, Owen.
Okay, thanks. I think the task of maturation is to be able to see your parents as just as normal people without having to have them be perfect or so flawed that they're invalidated, that you develop a realistic view of them, which is equivalent to a realistic view of yourself. Nobody is perfect. And the idea of the energy that goes into translating parents into either idealized forms or vilified forms takes away from your ability to grow yourself, to have your own life. And I think that that's really the view of not only maturation, but you use the word individuation, the ability to see yourself just as a person, just like those other people who, as a kid, you depended on, or hurt you, or loved you, or whatever. But that seeing yourself as a separate and equal individual with your flaws and strengths, I think, is the task of maturing and of all relationships, actually.
Thanks. Terry?
One of the reasons I think for the current trend that you were describing, I don't think it's psychological at all. I think it's economic.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I don't think it's necessarily healthy or unhealthy. It's a necessity of life at this time for some of us.
So, yeah, Barry?
I just to expand a little bit on what Terry has said. I think there's been a major shift in when people get married. I know most of my friends and I were married within a year after graduating from college. It was just the thing. It was your next step in life. You start your career, you get married, and have kids. I look at my children, 3 of the 4 were married before they were 30, 2 before they were married when they were in their mid-20s. My grandchildren, who are of the 5 adult children, only 1 is married, and she didn't get married till she was 30. And I think that's part of the concept. I know they joke around in my family that when I moved to Arizona, it was for me to get away from my children. Not for them, to me to move away from my children. And there's some truth to it too. There's a point where they become too dependent on you on a day-to-day basis. And I see that with my grandchildren and my kids. My grandchildren the adult grandchildren tend to be much more reliant on my children than my children were reliant on me at the same age. Whether it's economic, whether it's psychological, or whatever reason, I don't know. That's not my field, but I certainly can observe it.
Right. So that goes to Terry's point. Is it economic, or are there other factors? Terry and then Lisa.
Forgot. Go ahead, Lisa. Totally forgot what I was going to say.
Losing it.
No, lost it.
All right, I see a lot of hands. Let me just get a pad here so I can track who wants to speak. So we've got Lisa, Sarah Lee, Merle, and Kat. Okay, Lisa, you have the floor.
Oh, and I think it's the way we live now too. I think in a more agricultural society, generations of families were more dependent upon each other, lived more closely together because families would farm together, fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, whoever, it took generations of families to sustain agriculture. And we don't live that way, obviously, so much anymore. And so in an urban society, the expectation about what children will or will not do is perhaps different.
Okay, so living together in family units because of financial necessity.
Yeah, just the practical day-to-day of keeping, particularly if you have livestock, it takes a lot of people to keep that operation moving.
Okay, thank you. Terry, I see you. Sarah Lee?
I remembered. I was just going to say that there's a real difference in the way people approached marriage when I was getting married. I was married in 1966, and I would say this was typical of people who got married in the 60s. We didn't have a pot. We didn't have a dime between us. We were still in school. People got married because they got married, and then they struggled together and they built a life. But somewhere in the next 10 or 15 years, by 1980, even, I think, maybe the 90s, I don't know, the thought was that you had to be on your feet, independent financially before you would get married. That you had to have, people wanted to have the home and all the furniture in it and everything else done. And then they move in together and live, like happy days. But it wasn't that way 50 years ago.
Right. So I'm just, I'm looking at the 10 Commandments, which we read in yesterday's Parsha. And just a reminder, we've looked at this before. The 10th commandment, you shall not covet. And what does it say? You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife.
Well, I think they took that to the extreme and said, I'm going to have it all before I choose a wife because I don't want to covet anybody. I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah. Okay. I want to bring Sarah Lee, Merle, and Kat. You're up next. I just want to say something that, maybe people are shy to say, but, how much of this shift is also stemming from the sexual revolution and the availability of sexual activity outside of the context of marriage. You know, when we have a strong libido in our late teens and early 20s, and the only place to meet that need is in marriage. That's a driving force towards that marriage.
I think that's a really good point.
Once we remove that, there's less necessity for early marriage. And the corollary is we started off talking about the mamzerut, what it is to be a bastard. If you look at the percentage of children born out of wedlock when Terry was getting married versus now, I think there would be a dramatic shift. And as there is less stigma associated with bearing and raising children outside of a conventional marriage, that also allows for people to marry much later or not at all. So Sarah Lee.
Well, I just wanted to say this, and it's all been said already, that the whole idea of marriage is not in our kids' minds, in our grandchildren's generation. Marriage doesn't have the same pool for them. They feel they can be together without the bonds of marriage. And I have one of my friend's grandson is now 30 years old. He's been with his high school sweetheart all this time. They are not married. He's waiting till he is going to be financially secure, but they're living together all this time. There isn't a need to sanctify it anymore. And did we lose that in the sexual revolution? That it is something that I just don't understand. But as a grandmother, I was asking my daughter when my grandson and his girlfriend were visiting back and forth to each other's homes. And I said to her, are they going to get married? She said, yes, they're talking about having a family. Okay, I said, so why aren't they getting married? She said, I don't go there. I don't ask them that. I said, but they're supporting two different households and they're struggling. And here I said to her, why don't they just move in together? Which they finally did. And they have set a wedding date, which is a year from next week because of COVID. But, you know, I have changed my whole ideas of what life should be and marriage also, that I said, why don't they move in together and save some money?
Yeah.
I never thought I would say something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty forward thinking.
Really brave.
Merle and then Kat.
So apparently when I read this article last, I was so, I don't want to say touched by what it said, you know, the last couple of paragraphs, but I wrote down the names of people who, for lack of better terminology, were helicopter parents when their children, before and during their children's marriages. And I have seen what happened in some of those relationships, and it was really sad what the parents did to the kids, where they didn't have an opportunity to be married on their own without constant, you know, repetition of how, well, you should do it my way. And in another case, I see where some kids don't want to get married because they saw a really bad marriage and they're afraid that it might happen to them, whether it be genetics or just because this is all they've ever seen. And so it, you know, and to what Sarah Lee said about living together, in some of those cases where they don't want to get married because of what they've seen, they're very happy to living together, and they're doing fine. So I think that we have to give options, or just keep our mouths shut. And when they need advice, if they come for it and they listen, great. If they don't, then they're adults and they need that area to spread their wings.
Yeah, keeping your mouth shut, that is definitely a challenge. And what you're validating, Merle, is that you've seen examples of the negative aspect of not severing the parental connection and
Right.
trying to simultaneously establish a new primary connection. I remember my grandfather, my mom's father, said to me, you know, for better or worse, you know, once the cord is cut, it's cut. You know,
Right.
you can't, and it's not always an easy process. Kat, Terry, and Barry.
Okay, so I guess my perspective is a little different because I'm quite a bit younger than a lot of the folks in this group, but I think
Sorry about that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, really.
just
Need that.
bounce a little bit off of what Terry was saying, because I mean we're talking about my generation and my stepdaughter's generation at this point, not leaving home.
Yeah.
A lot of it is economic. We've been hit by 2 massive recessions since I've graduated from high school. I'm 32 years old. It's extremely difficult to find a job living here when you're young and don't have like a college degree that you can even afford to live by yourself. In fact, at this point, you just based on what I was reading recently, you need a job that pays about $17 an hour to afford a 1-bedroom apartment here in the Phoenix area. So
That's if you don't eat.
and that's if you don't eat. That's just,
Right.
you know, rent is, you know, minimum $1,200 a month, and that doesn't include utilities or other household costs. So if you're single and you don't have another another income in your household, it's really hard to afford to even consider the idea of moving out and living by yourself. Another consideration for at least, you know, like the kids in my stepdaughter's generation is health insurance. You know, a lot of kids will stay on their parents' health insurance policies. If you get married, you lose that coverage. And that can become extremely expensive if you're uninsured. And then another thing is to consider, like, folks that are my age that have chronic health conditions or who are disabled. If you're collecting like Social Security income through the CI program, if you get married, the combined benefits. So that can be another consideration just on the economic. You know, leaving home and setting up a partner, and kind of based on what Merle was saying is, you know, a lot of us have seen our parents' marriages, you know, my own included, and that does definitely kind of put a damper on of being married. You know, you grow up and you see how your parents interacted with each other, and you go, I don't want any part of that. My parent, you know, just kind of using my own family, my parents were miserable together for 25 years. And I waited until I was 25 years old to get married because I was like, well, I want to make sure I'm really, really sure that I'm along with this person, because I don't go through the sorts of hell that I witnessed growing up. You know, it's really hard as a child to kind of look at and go through those things, you know, from the third party perspective of being in the household and being around that kind of stress. You know, put that stress on yourself again, and then potentially any children that you may or may not have.
So first of all, I want to say, you know, how much I think we all particularly value and appreciate your willingness to study with us and join in this conversation. Yeah, somebody asked if we could mute wherever the dog is barking.
Oh,
Thank you. You know, we do skew a little bit older here in this group, and it's completely invaluable and meaningful to us to have your perspective. So, thank you for being part of this group. We appreciate that a lot. And, I hear you underlining primarily the financial challenges of the last decade and how those may be driving factors. And, an important reminder to all of us to not be judgmental about this situation in which we find ourselves with boomerang kids returning back to the nest, and also our responsibility to provide good examples of what a good relationship can look like to inspire our children. And it does raise the question of how much do we present an image to our children of a perfect relationship versus how much do we want to really engage them in conversation, particularly maybe as they get a little older and more mature, about the challenges of a long-term committed relationship and the rewards that make it worthwhile to stay connected in the face of those challenges. So I see a few more people want to participate, Barry and Terry, and then Matthew had a comment in the chat that we'll look at. But Barry Kipnis, yeah.
Just very, very quickly, how attitudes have changed. When my kids were getting married in the 80s, the two older ones, my daughter and her then fiance rented an apartment 2 months before they got married and moved in together. And Audrey was very upset with me because I wouldn't visit them. And I said I wouldn't visit them till after they were married because I thought it was wrong. And she pointed out to me that her brother was living with his fiance, who were getting married soon afterwards. And I have a double standard. And I said, yes, I do. I have a double standard because Bobby's fiance's situation is her father's problem. You're my problem. So, and
ownership there. Okay.
And now I have unmarried adult grandchildren who are living with significant others, and it is what it is. It's different, and I've had to change, and I have changed. It's just a different time, a different society, different world.
So you have been able to become more flexible and open in your thinking.
I know it's hard to believe, but I have.
So Matthew Newman in the chat just pointed out that it does happen that people get married in order to have health insurance. My own daughter, Jessie, has 2 different wedding dates. There was the big formal wedding ceremony, but for just that reason, they have a separate anniversary where we just did the civil marriage license so that one of them could be on the other's health insurance. So absolutely. Matthew and then David. Matthew,
unmute.
Yeah.
The instances I'm aware of all related to COVID-19. The couples have been together for years. It was all of a sudden the fear of one's losing a job and health insurance that caused them to finally get married because the one had a more stable job in each case than the other. And it turns out the one woman who finally got married to her father's, she was absolutely right that the company lay everyone off and there was no insurance. And had she not been married, by being married, she got her husband's insurance. So it was not the parent issue, it was the fear of the job market and not having insurance, which is why retires, even if they can afford the 63 and a half, because if you can afford it, you can always pay a COBRA and have medical insurance until you're 65.
Right.
The real retirement date is when you can have health insurance. So And I know older people have also gotten married for health insurance reasons after many years living together.
Yeah, it's a driving factor, Matthew. And as a rabbi, I have very frequently seen people stay in jobs that they really would otherwise prefer to leave because of the need to have insurance. And I think it's very unfortunate that people get stuck in a job that they don't otherwise find meaningful simply for the insurance. It's interesting you mentioned older people. I've also more than once been asked to officiate at a wedding for a senior couple who want to have a Jewish wedding, but not a civil wedding because they don't want to lose Social Security benefits. So it cuts both ways. And by the way, that is illegal for rabbis to do that. Not to say that it isn't done, but it is technically illegal. So David has a comment, and then let's look at a couple of things that have come up in the chat.
Well, from the years that I worked in the wedding business as a photographer, I have seen weddings covering every comment made so far. Young ones, because they want the father to know that his kid is his kid, to couples that decide to get married after a long period of time. And when I mean a long period of time, I mean a long period of time. The flower girl was their grandchild, and the pastor was the flower girl's great grandfather. So it's for financial reasons, for emotional reasons, for two families planning to get together for years. So there are reasons for every family, for every reason, but there are trends. And one of the trends that we've seen in that business was financial. It was getting more and more expensive for people to establish a home. So they just live together without establishing a union. So just an observation.
Yeah, so in your work, you also get to see a broad variety of choices that people make. So we have a robust conversation going on here in the chat. I don't want to lose this. So Kat and Michelle said, I'd just like to add that those of us that got married young and regretted it have cautioned our children to take their time and not be in a rush to get married. So that's, that goes to sharing more openly as children are older and able to learn from our experience, maybe. Robin Young confesses that she is living in sin and that financial advantage is a consideration, but certainly not the primary one for me, fortunately. Sometimes it is just that you always choose to be together versus having to be together by a contractual obligation. You wanted to say a little bit more, Robin, about that last sentence, what you're thinking?
Sure, definitely. And I've met other couples as well that have been together for a long time. And sometimes when there's like a view of a marriage is that, I don't know, you get lazy in the relationship, or it's like, yeah, it's, you got to do this, you got to do this, versus it's almost like being active, like, at the beginning of a relationship when everyone was more, putting more effort into it or things like that. And it's, maybe I'm not explaining that very well, but that's one of the things I've heard a lot more by people who are not getting married. It's that it's just, we're always actively choosing to be together, not that we're here.
So knowing that there's a relatively easy, at least legally, escape clause feels like it might be a motivation to put more energy into sustaining the relationship.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's necessarily for, me, and that's why I'm choosing that or anything. Like I said, there's no one reason for this. There's so many different facets for everyone's relationships. But I do think Terry's was very accurate when she said, people got married when they didn't have a pot to piss in. And and then when you grow something together, it's very different than starting lives separately. And then you're starting to merge things together, as well as, everyone had valid points, seeing, well, that marriage was not very good. And maybe, I have a higher self-worth of what I want. So I'm going to hold off and, see, make better choices. And even still, I'm divorced. I didn't make the best choice, except I got the best daughter. So, it's just life changes, but, and we do have a very moving society, I guess.
Well, thank you for trusting us to share that. Terry, you had your hand up?
Unmute, Terry.
My daughter has been living with somebody for 8 years, and they just exchanged rings. And they've made other financial commitments to each other, but this was the biggie. They have not gotten married. They both have had marriages that were not satisfying to them, and they may decide that they're really appropriate for each other in the next couple of years. But in the meantime, c'est la vie. What I wanted to comment on was my grandfather, and I think this might be a nice place to go. It goes back to Barry's comment. My grandfather was born in 1877. Now, I'm not 102. My father was a menopausal accident, 16 years younger than his nearest sibling. So my grandmother was in her 40s when she delivered him. So my father was 95, but it was my grandfather that most impressed me. 1877, by way of Alexandria, Egypt, by way of Chicago, finally to Phoenix. And watching, it's a very Fiddler on the Roof kind of a moment that I'm describing here. But first thing that one of his nephews married a non-Jew. My grandfather went through whatever, and then he said, that's the way it is now. Everything he watched changes in children and grandchildren and drugs and divorces and behaviors and things that that were not part of the first 60 years of his life or 70 years of his life. And I watched this man live to be 96. And in the last 15 years of his life, every social change that you could imagine, he died in about the mid 70s, I think, was happening before his eyes. And I watched this acceptance. I watched him, he didn't have to rationalize. It was just based on, well, the world changes. And he had seen enough, I guess, to know that. So I don't know. I thought that kind of reminded me of Barry's coming around.
Yeah.
Barry's eventual enlightenment.
Poor Barry.
At least
Yeah,
he changed. My great grandmother did not. She said Kaddish when my great uncle married somebody out of the religion. So she wasn't willing to change.
He was.
Thank you, Terry.
You're welcome.
We're just about
I
at
love it,
time.
showing
There's
up again.
a lot more discussion in the chat. Marcy Burgess has a family situation where the couple seem to be building a life together, but without benefit of marriage, and she's wisely, I guess, not addressing that directly. Merle Weiner is saying that, I think pointing to the financial reality of the world as it is today, that, being able to help as we can is a good thing. David Flax asked, is the ketubah by itself a recognized wedding document for the state? No, I don't think so. You need that state marriage license. Barry Singer's daughter didn't get married till 35, and now he wants to know, when are they going to have a kid? And Merle is kind of echoing Terry's point about elders who did set an example of adapting to change. And, one wonders, as Terry, as you was telling the story, I was wondering if your grandfather's ability to be flexible and adapt was part of why he was, he enjoyed the longevity that.
It's funny, that takes me back to a retreat conversation from yesterday
Oh, yeah.
about peace of mind and not fighting, not spending your life like I do in resenting and getting mad and, all the things we do, pouting, sulking,
God grant me the
angering.
ability to
Yes.
accept the things that I cannot change.
Right. But that peaceful state of mind is, stress kills.
Absolutely. My my next class that I have in just a few moments, so that's why I need to go, is a Musar class on the theme of worry.
No worries.
So this was a really interesting conversation, and much more extensive than I had anticipated. But it's a credit to Dov Peretz-Elkins for raising such a provocative issue. We have not discussed why this teaching might be addressed to a man more so than a woman. So I want to invite you to think about that. We'll pick up with that next time, and then maybe move into chapter 3. But the chapter 3 handouts are
Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Rabbi.
available to you.
Really?
There's still a sentence left. Don't push it.
Yeah, a whole sentence could be an entire.
So everybody have a good week.
Do we have class next week?
No. No.
I don't think so.
Shalom Aleinu, B'Yalkoi Yisrael, Ve'imru.
Imru, amen.
No class next week, so I will see you on the 21st.
By which time I will have forgotten the questions. So
Write it
that's
down.
fine.
We'll remind you, Terry. We'll remind you.
The
Put it in
question
your
is,
notes
why do men have to be told to let go of mommy and daddy and not women?
Oh, that's so good.